My product process is to basically go through, and it's like constantly refining, who is the customer, what is their problem, and how do I map the lightest and quickest solution? What does success look like? Um, and setting all of that, like, you're refining that understanding as you go, and you start with one and you sort of like work. Customer and problem are quite intertwined. I never know, like, did I discover the problem first in the customer or then vice versa? But it's like really figuring out and building an understanding. That's where I start. It's like, how do I understand, like, it's not like I start from scratch. I have problems with the term discovery because I feel discovery, which is what some people would call this, indicates that you just go out into the world and you discover problems. And I think that kind of, it obscures the fact that, like, you have hypotheses. Like, you always have a hypothesis. Like, it's your bias about what the problem is. So I always think of it as like, I have a hypothesis about who is my customer, what is their problem, and then I have a hypothesis about the solution. And I'm constantly validating that as we go. And sometimes that's by talking to people and like doing research with customers. It's by looking at their usage behavior, or it's by building something lightweight and putting it out into the world to validate that process, or to like act on that process. And always I'm setting success criteria ahead of time, because if I don't do that, then what happens is, like, we launch something or we like talk to people and we find data. And then again, because we haven't set success criteria ahead of time, we just sort of cherry pick, or we can't make a decision. It's both can happen. That's my sort of process in a nutshell. I think product process is always so interesting, because I think when people think about a product process, they always think like, oh, I'm launching this new product. And actually, I think this is the process you should be going through every time you're just thinking about, like, what's the next thing we're going to build? And that could be like an entire product, or it could be a feature. I think what you're trying to do is there is this thing we could build. Should we build it? That's the question. Or there is this problem we could solve. Could we solve it? That's like the fundamental question you need to start with. The first thing you need to do is try to figure out, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And you can do that quickly, but you're trying to ask and understand, like, what does the customer need here? And so I'm asking questions like, oh, if let's say it's like a bug, let's say it's something that came up, something broke. I ask, like, what broke? Why did it break? What were you trying to do? How did you hope it would work? To really get it, like, what is the underlying problem? And then, so I'm like asking those questions. I'm looking at data. I'm then trying to say, okay, now I know that this problem is this problem. Is it worthwhile solving? So then when I'm asking, is it worthwhile solving? I'm trying to figure out, how wide reaching is this? Like, what is the impact of this? These are the questions I'm asking myself. Like, who would benefit from it? Would they pay us for it? And what I'm trying to do is assess, you're always assessing this question of, is it worth solving now? Or how big of a problem is it relative to the other things that you could be solving? And I'm always thinking about it. And then I'm thinking, so I've gone through and I'm like, okay, it's worth solving. And people like determine the value often very prescriptively, or like with something like a RICE score. If you wanted to do that, if you're really tied to like quantifying it. My problem with RICE scores is that, like, they add a level of false precision. Like, it makes you think it's an objective score when actually it's often a subject. It's like a number you came up with, and then you put the numbers together. And then, but if that helps you, you're trying to like rank the relative importance of this thing. Then you're trying to think about, and this is when you should be bringing your team along through all of this. But then you sit down and you say, okay, this is the problem. How could we solve that problem? And a very tactical way in which I do this is, I actually like bring the team together, and the team could be, it depends on who's interested. It could be all the engineers, an engineer who might work on this, your tech lead, your designer. And we sit down and we talk about like, what I have everybody do is I have everybody say, okay, this is the problem that we're trying to solve. This is why it's an important problem. We're going to spend 5 to 10 minutes. Everybody take a sticky and independently write down what you think is the best way that we can solve this. And then if people are remote, we do stickies like in Mural or PowerPoint. And then I say, take that sticky, and now we're going to do just like an effort versus impact kind of matrix. It's like a 2x2. And we just say like, okay, for each one of these things, just at a very high level, like you described the solution, like what do we think is the relative impact and value of this? And we like put everything on this matrix and we talk it through. One, it helps for everybody to independently come up with those ideas so you don't bias each other. Two, it helps to like discuss it as a group, because then you like bring everybody back together and people are like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, and you flush stuff out. The impact versus value, I think, impact versus effort is important, because the measure that I'm always thinking of is like, how do we deliver customer value, but how do we do so quickly? And so you're looking at effort because you need to know like, how long is this thing going to take us? And is it going to take us longer than it's is actually valuable, like to the person on the receiving end? And also, can we take a solution that we initially conceive of as being like very high effort and very high impact, and can we like break it down into something that's lighter weight? So then we've sort of identified all of the possible solutions. We talk about them as a team. We like very roughly do this like impact versus effort trade-off. And we identify as a team, okay, maybe there's like the top 3 that we would consider. Then what I do is I typically sit down with my designer, depending on the designer. Some designers like to sketch with me. Some designers, where we talk through like, what does a potential solution look like? Like, how would we implement this? Before, or they will go off and they'll do like 3 designs of it or something. Very lightweight, like sketches. And we'll talk a little bit about, okay, these are the 3 possible options. At that point, I will typically like sit down with the eng team and say, we talked about feasibility initially. Let's look at like what we're talking about, like what this could look like. Let's talk about feasibility again. I also like to, when we talk about designing a product or the design phase or the solve phase, whatever you want to call it, I think about that. I think it's really important that you involve engineering, like you put engineering and design in a room together and you make them talk through. Because sometimes I found like designers come up with these like really almost infeasible things. Like they're beautiful and they solve the problem, but like we could never implement them. And if you do that for too long, you've moved too far away from what the engineering team can actually do. And it's very alienating to the team. So we come back with a couple of sketches. We talk to the engineering team about feasibility. We may like pare stuff down. Like I tend to be pretty open. Again, I'm very practical. And I set that expectation of practicality with the whole team. I'm like, engineering's going to have to be practical. We may have to take on some tech debt. Design may have to deal with some stuff that's, that's like design debt. I describe everything as debt to them. And so we come up with, again, maybe like 3 versions of it. I'll take those wireframes back and really quickly, again, depending on how difficult it is to build something, if it's not that difficult and you can quickly validate after you've built it whether or not it will work, that's fine. But if it's going to take a lot of effort to build any 3 of those options, then I'm going back to customers and we'll just quickly do like, it's like somewhere between a concept test and a usability. It's not a usability test, but it's really saying like, you see these like, and these are wireframes. Like I put wireframes in front of customers a lot and we'll say, this is the problem we think you have. Like, does this solve that problem? And that's the solution, right? Like these are our solution hypotheses, and we get reactions to like different designs and different solutions, and the customer will tell us like yes or no. Again, if this is going to take a lot of effort, I would do all of these steps. And then typically, again, we've set like, okay, we need customers to like respond overwhelmingly to this and not that. as our success criteria. If they're sort of neutral on all three, then we'll just pick the one we think is best. And then we'll go back to the eng team and we'll say like, okay, now like we're going to start building it. The one thing I like to do if possible is actually this is why I like to do wireframes and then high fidelity mocks, is like wireframes also help people stay in the mindset of, oh, this is not the final thing. This is still the sketchy thing and we're still going to talk about it. So often what I'll have the eng, like what we'll do with the eng team is the eng team will then start doing a lot of the back end work to begin to implement one of those options. We'll begin talking about like, okay, what if once we launch this, like what would success look like? How would we know if this was working? What would we do if this wasn't working? How much longer are we going to invest in this thing? And so they're building, and then the designer is beginning to think about a more full-fledged kind of design, like high fidelity mocks. But what I like is getting the back end started quite early, because often once they start implementing, they realize like, oh, there's a problem here. And so the front end actually like changes. So the designer is not too tied to their design, and the eng team knows that we are going to have this conversation as we go. Then we've like, you know, we're getting close. Once we have like something working, I may, again, depending on how risky this thing is, how big it is, I may have another round of customers like alpha test it, internal people dog food it, like we just kick the tires on all of it. Oh, as we've gone, this is kind of like the development process. As we've gone through this process, I'm kind of testing these ideas both with customers in the ways that I said, but also previewing like, what have we learned about the customer, their problem, with all of the audiences? So with the core team, with the leadership team, with the executive team, with sales and marketing. So that people, that's actually another form of validation. Like that's what we're doing. We're sharing with the org where we're going, but we're also validating our ideas with the org. And then, you know, and I also share success criteria. This is what success would look like with everybody. So we're all aligned and we've set it ahead of time so that once this thing then launches, we are all aligned on whether it was successful or not. Again, you don't want to get into a launch and then you're looking at customer behavior and like you're looking at usage data and what you think is successful, because often when you launched it, you have a lower bar for success than everybody else. You want success to be like consistent, like agreed to across the board. So then people can't say like, oh, this is not working, I want you to fix this. The common success criteria also means you know kind of what to fix. And then you launch and you see like if you're hitting that criteria. And also part of designing, I should add, and launching, designing also, I include marketing in all of those conversations, because I want marketing from the beginning to inform and understand who is the customer, what is the problem, what is the solution, what does the solution look like? Because then once we actually go to market, they know exactly how to and who to market this to. Too often I found people like build products and then throw them over the wall to marketing to be marketed. And that's a good way to have an unsuccessful product, because the first time people will experience your product is in that marketing experience. It's not in looking at the pixels on the screen. It's in, you know, like ads or emails or or sales presentations. Like that's how people experience it. So we've tested all of that and everybody's been brought along to inform that. We set success criteria and then we like pray like hell, but measure like hell and see if we're meeting that criteria. And then I also like to kind of have, if I've been good, I've also set like decision dates. So my success criteria also is like, we should hit this metric and we will assess it at this time. And we will make a decision about what we do next. So it's success criteria, but also decision criteria that you've set and you're evaluating, and then you're bringing people together to say like, so it's past the launch announcement, right? Like you do the launch announcement, you're super excited, and then you're like, cool, this is the day we're all going to get back together and decide how this went.